Hi everyone, welcome to Java Techie. Today we'll dive into part 5 of our in-depth Spring Boot interview QA series. But before we get started, if you have not checked out previous videos, then be sure to do that for a solid foundation. Okay? Alright. So without any further delay, let's get started. So let's begin with our first question, that is, how will you handle exception in your project? So in real-time project, how can you handle the exception if you are using Spring or Spring Boot framework? Okay. So let me walk you through one example. Then I will guide you step by step how you can handle the exception and how you can populate correct error message to the end user. So if I will go to the existing code, if you remember we have created a method called get the product by product type. Okay. And if you go and check in the service, we have just written this. We are fetching from the list by filtering the product type, and then if it is optional, if it is null, then we are just throwing this runtime exception, products not available for the type. This is the type. Fine. Now if you observe in the list, we have different product type: electronics, education, baby and kids. Okay. Now apart from any of these three value, if I will give any different product type, then my method should throw the error. So let's go to the browser and I will hit 8181 product search. If I'll give electronics, I'm getting two record which is there in my list. If I'll give something like, I'm getting 500 internal server error. Now if you'll go and check in your console, we are getting the error here, right? With the message product not available for the type. This is the type which is my input. Now let me try some different input. Let's say something like spores. We are getting again 500 error, and if you see in the console, we got the error message saying that products not available for the type sports. Okay, so that's fine, we are getting the error correctly. That is what we are expecting. But when a end user will try this particular endpoint, what he will get here? He will get 500. Now by saying this internal server error 500, end user may not understand anything. He might not be a technical person, right? You need to tell him, hey, you are giving this ports as a input, which product type is not supported in our system. So you need to populate the correct error message to the end user. How can you do that? That's very simple. Okay. So first, what I will do, I will not throw the runtime exception. Rather than throwing the runtime exception, let's make it generic so that I can create my custom exception and I can throw it. Okay. So for that, what you can do, let me create a exception class. Let's name it product not found exception inside the exception package. Now next, it is up to you whether you want to make your exception class as a runtime exception or checked exception. Based on that, you can extend it from corresponding exception. If I will extend it from exception, then this will be act as a checked exception. If I will extend it from runtime exception, then it will be unchecked exception. Fine. Once you have extended from runtime exception, then I just want to define the constructor and I want to populate the error message. So that is how I have defined this string message. Next, go to the service. So instead of throwing this runtime exception, let me throw the product not found exception. Okay. Now this makes sense, right? Now if the product type is not listed in the list, it will throw me product not found exception with this particular error message. But again, since I am throwing it from my application, I will see the error message only in the console, right? But in the browser, I'll get 500 internal server error. That does not make any sense. Then how can I populate the error message I'm getting in the code to the response as a response? Okay, so that is very simple. That is the reason there is an annotation called @rest controller advice. By defining a class and by annotating @rest controller advice, you can tell to the Spring Boot, hey, if you are getting this particular kind of error, then map it, extract the error message and set some additional field and return it to the user so that he can understand it. Let me do that. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll just create something like new package, then I'll just create a class Then next, simply annotate this class with @rest controller advice. Now, which type of exception you want to handle? Product not found exception, right? For that, what you need to do? You need to simply define one handler method. So let me define public will return me the error DTO. If you observe in the error DTO, I have defined these three fields. What is the status of the result? What is the error message? And what is the status code? These are the three custom message I have created. I mean custom attribute I have defined to this error DTO. You can add as per your requirement. So I am returning the error DTO. Handle. What is the exception type we want to handle? Product not found exception. So I have just defined the meaningful method name so that by seeing the method someone can understand, okay, this method will handle the product not found exception. That is up to you. You can define handle exception or anything, you can define your method name. So which type of exception it will handle? Product not found exception. Fine. Next, just annotate here @exception handler for which type of exception? Product not found exception dot class. If any exception occurs with this particular exception dot class, then the request will delegate to this particular method. Now inside this method, how you want to customize your error message, that is up to you. Okay, so I have created the error DTO, then I am just saying the status as a fail. So let me name it EX, and I am setting the error message what exactly I will get from the service layer. Then I am setting the status code to the 500, which is internal server error. That's fine. Now let's see if I will start the application whether we are getting the correct error message or not. Okay, instead of 500 what we are getting currently, whether we are seeing it or we are getting our error DTO response. So let me restart it. So it started. Let me clear this console, go to the browser, and let me hit the same request. If you observe in the response what we are getting here, the status is fail. Error message is saying that okay, the product is not available for the input product type, and this is what the internal server error. Now if we will populate the error message like this to the end user, he can easily understand, okay, this is what the mistake I have done and that is the reason I am getting this error message. Now he can fix the input, he can pass whatever the valid input, and he will get the result. Okay, so if you will not give the correct input, you will get the error message, valid error message, rather than this ugly 500 internal server Spring default template. Okay, now if you go to the code and if you observe in the service layer, I have defined another method which is save product method. So while persisting the product object, I mean we are not persisting since we have not connected to the DB, but while adding to this list, if that product ID is already exist, then we are throwing the exception. So for that also let me create a custom exception. I need to handle this kind of exception as well, right? So first let me validate this use case, then we can handle the exception. So go to the postman. Let's say I will just add this request. The request is added and I was getting list of response, I mean list of product. Now since this ID is already there in my list, if I will try to save it, I should get the error. I am getting 500 internal server error. Again by seeing this error, user can't understand anything. We need to handle it the way we have handled for product not found exception. Similarly, you need to create a custom exception and you need to map it with your exception handler. Okay, the approach is straightforward. So let me create a custom exception class. Just name it something like duplicate product found exception or something like that. Extends it from runtime exception. Then simply I will define the constructor with the message. Fine. Now let me copy this name. I'll go to the service. If this particular scenario occurs, then instead of runtime, just throw me the duplicate product exception. Okay, and with this particular error message. Now the way we have mapped this particular exception to the handler, similarly we need to handle this, right? So what I'll do, I will simply copy this, then I'll just change the exception name, which is duplicate product exception. I need to tell to the handler, hey, if you are getting duplicate product exception error, then execute this particular method. So I will just change the method name. Now let it be. I mean, the status will be fail and we'll get the exit error message, and the status code is internal server error. It is up to you. Based on your need, you can set the status code. If sometimes user is giving the bad request, I mean the request input is not correct, you can send the bad request here. Okay, this is up to you. Fine, let me run it now. So it started. Now let me go to the browser, I mean the Postman. First I will add this request. Since this is the fresh startup server, so this list will not have this particular ID before, so we have added it. Now when second time I will try to add the same ID and same product with the ID, let me send the request. What we are getting? We are getting the correct error message. Status is fail, error message. Product code already exists in the system. This is what the ID which is already exist in the system. Now user understand, okay, this ID is getting duplicated in the system, so I need to change it. He changed something and then he sent the request, the record is got inserted. Okay, this is how we need to handle the exception in our project using the Spring Boot exception handler and REST controller advice. But if you are using Spring Boot 3.0 onwards version, any version more than Spring Boot 3, then you have a good news. You no need to define your custom error DTO class. You no need to define your own class to map the error messages. Then what you can do, up next to the Spring Boot 3, there is a class defined called problem detail. Okay, now let me comment this. You can simply do return problem detail dot for status and detail. Now set the status code, which is internal server error, and what is the error message? Ex dot get message. Similarly, you can also do the same for handle duplicate product exception. Let me comment this. Let me change the return type to problem detail, then just define this. You can also customize the attribute of this problem detail. If you see here, you can set the title, status, instance, and you can set couple of properties as per your valid error message. You can customize that. Okay, let me restart and will verify once again. So it started. Just clear this, go to the browser and let me hit this particular endpoint. Now we are getting internal server error, status code is 500, but we are getting the detailed message here. Okay, same if we will do here, we are getting the correct error message. Fine. So this is the way you can handle the exception and you can customize your error message based on your need. Now let's move to the next question, that is, how can you avoid defining multiple handler for the exception, or what is the best practice for handling the exception? So if you observe in your code, if you observe in this particular handler class, we have defined product not found exception. I mean, we have defined the handler for product not found exception, and we have defined another handler for duplicate product exception. Now let's think that in my application or in my project I am getting 10 different type of exception. Then do I need to define 10 different exception handler? Is this the good way to implement in the code? Not at all. Then how we can do that? Let me go through one use case, then you can understand how we can avoid defining multiple handler to just handle different type of exception. Okay, so let me go to the product service. So here if you observe, I have defined one method called fetch location. Rather than modifying the existing code to demonstrate this particular use case, I have defined one method called fetch location. Then I just define a flag to just toggle the call between DB and REST API call. So let's say I just want to fetch location of any store ID. If the flag is true, it will fetch from the DB, but if the flag is false, it will do the REST API call. So I have not write the actual logic here. To just demonstrate the use case, you can write the logic here, but I am just throwing the exception. if request came to the DB, there could be some exception occurs in the DB side and we are getting this particular exception. Okay, and similarly you need to write the actual logic to just do the REST API call, but since this is the demo, I am throwing the HTTP client error. Now if I will give the flag as a true, I will get data retrieval failure exception. If I will set the flag as a false, I will get HTTP client error exception. Now the approach that we understand before, do I need to write two different handler for this retrieval failure exception and HTTP client error exception, like the way we have defined here for product not found and duplicate product exception? No, not at all. That is the reason I am trying to cover this particular use case. So if you go to the service, these are the two different type exception. So to avoid that, what I will do, I need to suppress these two different type of exception with my custom exception. For example, let me define a custom exception. Let's name it something like product service exception. Then extends it from runtime exception. Just define the constructor. Okay, now I need to suppress any kind of exception with this particular custom exception. So how I can do that? Very simple step. Just keep your actual business logic inside try and catch. Okay, in catch just handle any type of exception you are getting, then throw your custom exception and get the message from the exception. Very simple. I no need to care about which type of exception I am getting of this particular business call, whether it is data retrieval exception or whether it is data illegal exception or data constraint violation exception or any type of HTTP exception I am getting. I no need to care about it. I just need to suppress that exception by catching it. Then I am throwing my custom exception. Okay, now I no need to handle this and these two different handler. So what I can handle? This particular exception. So if we'll go here, this exception handler, let me copy this. Fine. Then I will just change the exception class name. So I'm just returning it. Okay. So I'm telling here, if you are getting product service exception, just populate this particular error message to the end user. Okay. Let me start it. So it started. Now just go to the browser. Let me check the endpoint for it. So just define the flag and store ID. So just go to the browser. I can just define here /store. Now if I'll set true, the request will go to the DB. Okay, and we are getting, see the error message correctly. Store not available in system with store ID. Fine, we are getting the correct error message. But if I'll make it false, what we are getting? REST client error occurred while fetching store information. So it depends on the flag whether it is hit your DB or it will do the REST API call. Based on that, you are getting the correct error message. And what we avoid here? We just avoid by defining multiple handler. Rather, what we did here, we just simply suppress that particular, different type of error message with our custom error message. So this is the best practice to implement exception handling in your project. Fine, let's move to the next question, that is how will you validate or sanitize your input payload. Okay, any request is coming to your application, how you can validate those fields, how you can validate your bean coming to your endpoint as a request. That's interesting. If you'll go to your controller class, now if I'll go to the product controller, I have defined a method called save product, and this will accept the input as a product object. Now before I process this particular request, I need to validate each and every field of this particular product, right? So based on that, I can process it. If the all the input are correct, I will execute this particular method. If not, I will throw the error message. That is what the expected result, right? And this particular implementation you can do from the client side, and you can do from the server side. So what I am trying to explain is now server side input validation or bean validation. But if you are using JavaScript or TypeScript, you can also do the input sanitization from there itself. Okay. Now how can I validate the each and every field of this particular input? Very simple. So first step, you need to define a dependency which is Spring Boot starter validation. This dependency is required to perform bean validation. Fine. Now once you have done with that, then go to that particular class and then you can play with this particular annotation. I'll cover each and every annotation. So if you observe here, these annotations came from jakarta.validation.constraints. Okay, so this is earlier it was from the Javax, but after Spring Boot 3, this is migrated to Jakarta. And if you observe, let's say this particular id field, I don't want it to be empty or I don't want it to be null. So that is the reason I have defined @ not null. If the field is coming as a null, then this particular, because of this annotation, will get the error. Okay, this field should not be null, and also I don't want this field to be empty. So that is the reason I have defined not empty. Okay, then if you observe the field called name, I have set here not blank. Name should not be null or empty. So if you want to go for empty, use not empty. If you want to check for null, go for not null. But if you want to check for both not null and not empty, then go for not blank. Okay, this @not blank will cover both empty and null check. Fine. Now let's say I just want to define some min and max value for this particular field. Now I can set the minimum value is 499 and maximum value for this particular field should be 1 lakh. So based on that, I also define the error messages. Now also for this model, I don't want it to be empty or null. So that is the reason I have defined not blank. But if you also want to specify some particular input type, I mean let's say this particular field should contains the alphanumeric, then you can also define @pattern. Okay, this is another annotation to just define your, I mean just validate your input. Now let's say you have some different field called email. Okay, let's say private string, and you want to validate this email ID. You can define your @own pattern and you can define your own regular expression. If you don't want to do that, just define @email. And if you observe, this @email is also came from Jakarta. Can you see here? Jakarta.validation API 3.0.2. Also, the way you have done for min and max check for double value. So if you have something called decimal value, you can also use @decimal min and @decimal max. For example, let's say I have something called big decimal, private big decimal, let's say some number. Okay, I want to define the min and max for it, so I can define decimal min and decimal max. Can you see here? And you can define some messages and some number. Okay, so that is fine, you can play with that. I mean I'm just covering different type of annotation we have to just validate the bean. Similarly, let's say you have some boolean field and you want to validate whether the input should be true or false. Let's say I've defined something like private, and I want this particular field always should be true, so I can use assert true. And similarly, if you want this particular value always should be false, you can define assert false. Okay, like this you can validate the boolean field. Let's not comment this, let it be there in the code only, so that you guys can use it as a reference. Fine. Now let's say I have some date field, let's say private. Okay, I have the date called birth date. I just want to make sure that this particular date should be on the future date, so you can define @future. Okay, and let's say I just want to define this date should be always past date, I can define past. Okay, so there are different type of annotation, guys. You need to use based on your requirement, based on the way you want to validate your bean. For now, let me comment this. I will go with only above validation. Okay, now we have just defined all the different type of annotation. Now to tell to the Spring Boot, hey, can you please validate the input which I am getting, because I have defined all the required validation specific annotation. You please validate the input. All set. Now let me restart the application. So it started. Let me clear the console. Go to the Postman. So intentionally we will give the wrong input to just verify whether the validation is working or not. So as we know, this ID should not be empty or should not be null. And what is the name? Name also should not be null, right? So I'm just giving name as a null. And price, what is the price range we have defined in the product? It should be within 4,999 to 1 lakh. So let me define 200. And model should not be null, and product type is education. Let it be. Let's validate these three fields. Now let me send the request. We are getting bad request which is 400, right? Now if you go and check in your console, what we are getting here? Resolved method argument. What is this? Method argument not valid exception. Okay, validation failed for argument. What all argument is getting failed? There are total 3 error. The error is for name field, and I mean all the 3 error, right? We have done the mistake for the 3 field. See here, name should not be null or empty. Similarly, there is error in the price because we have defined 200, and the mean and max we have defined here, and you'll get the error message here. Let me show you that price should not be less than 499 because we have just given 200. Similarly, you will find the last error message, ID should not be empty. So since these 3 fields having the incorrect value, we are not able to process this request and we are throwing the error message. But again, by showing this particular error message in the console does not make any sense, right? How I can populate this particular error message to the end user? So that is also very simple. We have tried for 2 different exceptions just now before. Okay, so which type of exception we are getting? Method argument not valid exception. So in our exception handler, if we will map this particular exception, then we can get all the error messages, right? The way in the exception handler we have mapped the product service exception, duplicate product exception. Similarly, we can map this particular exception, right? Method argument not valid exception. Then all sorted. We can get all different type of exception and we can just return it back to the end user. So let me copy this. Which type of exception is this? Method argument not valid exception. Now here I will get a single error message or multiple error message? Multiple, right? So I cannot capture with a single object. So what I will do, I will just use the map. Okay, map of string. So in a key I will keep what is the I mean what is the field is giving the error, and the value what exactly the error or what exactly the cause of that field we are getting the error. Okay, that's cool. Now what I will do, I'll just remove everything. Now just extract all the different type of error message what we are seeing here from this particular argument. How we can get that? Exception.get binding results. Okay, then from get field error, all the field error we are getting, then simply dot iterate it. Okay, so let's say this is the error. Now once you have the error, I mean each and every error from the list what we are seeing here, now what I can do, I'll just define a map. Now what you can do, you have the map. In the map just put what is the field is causing the error, just add it, get it from the error dot get field name, and in the value what is the region of that particular error. Okay, so from error dot get default message, that's it, just return the map. Now what will happen? If any validation error occurs, this will throw this particular exception, right? And we are just handling that particular exception and extracting all the field from that particular exception and we are keeping in a map as a field name and what is the error of that particular field. Let me restart the application. Just go to the postman and we'll go with the same invalid payload, and we'll see, since we are doing the mistake in the 3 field, let's see what is the result we are getting. Can you see here? We are getting the error for these 3 field. Price should not be less than 499. Name should not be null or empty. ID should not be empty. These are the 3 mistakes we are doing in our payload, and we are able to see the correct error message. Now by populating this particular error message to the end user, he can understand, okay, these are the field I am giving wrong input, let me correct it and I can get the result. Okay, that is how you need to populate the correct error message to the end user to identify his mistake. And this is how you can handle it bean validation exception by just capturing the method argument not valid exception. Okay, that's fine. Now let's move to the next question, that is, okay, we have covered this 52. Now the next question is, how can you define custom bean validation? Okay, for example, if you will go to the product class, we have defined couple of annotation, right? All are from Jakarta, not null, not blank, min, max. I mean, we also discussed few of the annotation. But apart from that, I want to introduce my own validation annotation. So let's take a use case. So currently the product type will be education, electronics and baby and kids. That is what we have in our system, right? So I want user to only pass these 3 product type. If user is giving some different product type while persisting the product object, then I will not allow him to give that input. So I can restrict some sort of input for a specific field by defining my custom bean validation annotation. So how we can do that? How can I define my custom validation to restrict few of the field to a particular input? So it's very simple. Okay, let me show you that. So I have created a package called validation. So nothing, I have just defined an annotation here. Can you see here? If you observe here, I have defined an annotation called validate product type, and I have defined a default error message. Invalid product type, it should be either electronics or education or baby and kids. Okay, these are the 3 product type currently I am supporting. So that is the reason I have defined this annotation, and the implementation of this annotation you can find here. If you observe carefully, product type validator implements from constraint validator, and this is what the annotation I have defined, and the field I want to validate is of type string. Okay, can you see here? And I am having the set of input electronics, education and baby kids. If the input what you are giving, if does not contains, I mean this list does not contains that input, return the false. That is what I have defined here. Okay, now this is very simple guys, just implements from the constraint validator and just define, I mean override is valid method and define what field you want to restrict for that particular input. So currently I have set for electronics, education and baby kids. Apart from these 3, if any input will come, this will return the false and you will get the error. Fine. So what I will do, I will use this particular annotation in my product field, product type. So I will just use product type, validate product type. Okay, this is the annotation we have defined, right? Now all good. Let me restart the app. Just clear this, go to the postman. Now instead of education I will give something like fashion. Okay, and let me send the request. Can you see here, one more error is added here. For field product type, invalid product type, it should be either electronics or education or baby and kids. So you have only restriction to pass any field from these 3 value. Okay, so this is how you can define your custom validation annotation, and you can restrict some sort of value for a particular field, or you can define the constraints. Okay, so this is what you can play with the exception handling in real time. I mean there are multiple scenario, and but same thing you can also do from client side, which is JavaScript. Okay, but these are the things what I explain is server side bean validation. Now let's move to the next question. Let's say interviewer asks you one use case that you find a bug in production environment and now you want to debug that scenario. How can you do that from your local? Because usually our local points to the dev environment setup like database configuration, Kafka configuration and any other configuration, right? But you want to debug it in the prod environment. So for that, first in local you need to switch the environment. That's the challenge. How can you do that? From my local, how can I switch back to the prod environment and I can continue my debugging? That's where, to overcome this issue, Spring Framework introduced a concept called Spring Profile. Profile in a Spring or Spring Boot allow developers to define different set of configuration for their application depending on the environment it is being run in. Okay, so if you want to define, let's say I want to point to prod or stage, I want to use the Spring Profile so that from my local I can switch back to the corresponding environment and it will load the corresponding configuration. Okay, so that is the main purpose of using Spring Profile. Now let me show you how we can do that, how we can enable the profile for specific environment. So for now, since I don't have multiple database, what I have done, I have created three different schema. Can you see here? Java Techie, Java Techie prod schema and Java Techie stage schema. Okay. So what I want to do, since I want to debug it in the production, I want this schema to be loaded, and if I do any operation, things will be performed in this particular schema. Okay, so for that, to define different configuration of my DV, if you will go to the code, usually we keep our DV configuration in Spring Boot in application.properties file, right? So if you'll check here, I have application.properties file and I have defined all the DB specific configuration. Come MySQL, JDBC driver, and you can see here the schema name is Java Techie. Similarly, to define multiple environment, you can follow this pattern to define your properties file. Application hyphen then environment name then dot extension dot properties. Okay, so if you'll see here, dev I don't have anything. I can simply delete it because the default one will be considered as a dev. But if you'll go to the stage, can you see here the data source URL what I have defined here? Java Techie underscore stage. That is what I have defined here, right? Now if you'll go and check in the prod, I have defined Java Techie hyphen underscore prod, and same I have defined in my DV viewer. So here I have defined environment specific configuration. So if you will go here, if you will go to the configuration class, I mean config package, I have defined something called Kafka config. I mean this is the hard coded data. So what I am doing here, I am creating the Kafka properties for dev environment, for stage environment, for production environment. So since I want to debug it in the prod, I want to use the this particular prod environment. Okay, and what annotation I have defined, this particular configuration will be loaded if the profile is prod. This particular configuration will be loaded if the profile is stage. Similarly, this will be loaded for dev. Okay, now we have defined, okay, enable this particular bean for this profile, enable this particular bean for this profile, but you need to tell to the Spring that which environment you want to enable. Okay, so how you can do that? Simply you can go to the application.properties and you can define here Spring dot active dot profile dot active, I guess, profiles dot active, and which environment you want to active. Now I want to active the prod because I want to continue my debugging in the prod environment. Now any operation I will do will be perform in this particular prod schema. Okay, it should load the prod Java Techie underscore prod schema, and it should load the this particular prod Kafka configuration, this one. Okay, so we can verify this in the SOPLN. And how we can verify whether the things are getting populated or things are loaded from the DB perspective, I will add a product object and will observe where it is getting stored in Java Techie stage or Java Techie prod or Java Techie. Okay, so what I will do, let me restart the application. Okay, so it started. First let's verify these Kafka related things, whether it is loaded the prod thing or stage things. So if I'll zoom this for you, I should find the log statement. Yeah, can you see here? Prod been initialized. So it enabled the profile for prod environment and it started loading the prod specific configuration. So that is the reason we are getting these messages. Fine, let me clear this. Now I will go to the Postman and I will save a product object. Okay, so or I'll save some different object. Let's say user details, because I don't think this product is an entity. So let's verify it. Go to the product. This is the product, right? Yeah, this is not an entity, so I want to use some entity. Let me see what all entity I have in this example. User details. Okay, ID will be auto generated, name and age, these two field I need to pass. And what is the endpoint to store the user? Go to the controller. This is the post mapping slash users. Insert a new user. So simply go to the postman. I'll filter, I have tried it before. Users, I want to add this Basant and age 31. Now let me send the request. It should load in the prod db. I mean Java Techie underscore prod schema. Let's see that. So record got inserted. ID 1, name this, age 31. Now let me refresh this. Java Techie prod, this is the table. Java Techie stage, table is not created. Okay, because I enable the prod environment in my profile, and if I'll verify the record, if I'll see the data, I can see the record is getting inserted to Java Techie underscore prod, because that is what the configuration is loaded from my application. This particular configuration is loaded because I enable the profile as a prod. Now let's say I will change it to the stage. I want to debug in the stage environment. Let me restart it and we'll verify whether it is loading the stage specific properties or configuration or not. We'll verify both Kafka and this one. Okay, so it started. Now let's see. Yeah, can you see here? Stage been initialized. We are getting these messages from Kafka config. Can you see here? Stage been initialized. It means it load the stage specific Kafka configuration, because that is what the active environment we have set to our profile. Now let's see, I will add some user object and whether it is getting stored in the prod or stage we want to verify. Okay, I mean basically we want to verify which configuration it is getting loaded. So just go to the postman. I'll change something, let's say Santosh 33 1 Santosh 33. The ID is 1 means it is not went to the prod, right? Because it is a fresh record. Let's verify that. Let me refresh this. Can you see here? It created the table in the stage and you can see the result. Now it is on my hand which environment I want to switch and continue my debugging. Okay, so that can only possible if you are using Spring profile concept. And how you can enable the Spring profile concept? That is a straightforward approach. You just need to define who is the active profile you want to use for now. Either you can define it in your properties file. If you want, you can also pass as part of the VM argument. Okay, here also you can pass the active profile, which environment you want to make as a active. Okay, so this is how you can implement the profile to switch the environment in real time. Now let's move to the next question, that is, how can you enable a specific environment without using profiles, or what is the best alternative to profiles to achieving the same use case? How can I switch my environment without using profile? Is this possible? First of all, yes, it is possible. In old Spring version, the only available scenario, I mean only available features to handle this kind of scenario is Spring profile. But in Spring Boot, there is a concept called condition. Okay, based on condition, you can turn on and turn off some sort of configuration. How we can do that? Let me show you. Okay, so what I'll do, let's say I will define some field. Let's say app active.environment. Okay, first let me comment this profile related stuff because I don't want to rely on the profile. Same use case I want to achieve using my condition annotation. Okay, so I have defined app.active environment equal to prod. Fine. Now go to the configuration because I want to load the configuration based on the value I have defined here. If I will define dev, it should load the dev specific configuration for me. If I will define stage, it should load the stage specific configuration for me. That is what I want to achieve without using profile. Okay, let me show you how we can do that. So first let me show you, there are couple of annotation. Okay, let me show you here. Conditional, can you see here? Conditional on available endpoint, conditional on bean. You can toggle the feature based on the bean present in your class path or not. Condition on blocking discover enable. I mean there are so many options to do this kind of profiling, okay, using this condition. So if you observe here, conditional on missing bean. Let's say if that bean is missing, then enable this particular feature or enable this particular configuration. On missing class, on property, on repository type. I mean there are tons of conditional annotation is there. You can explore more about it, but I just want to take the simple approach to achieve this particular use case. Okay, so what I want to do, I want to define, hey, conditional on property. Okay, because I have defined the property, right? I have defined the property here, key and value. If this particular value is present, then enable the prod specific configuration. That is how I want to define conditional on property, where prefix will be, what is the prefix you have defined here in the properties file? App active, right? When the prefix will be app.active and name will be environment. If it is having the value dev, then load this particular properties. I mean load this particular configuration. So let me comment this profile related stuff. Now let me copy the same for other bin. Comment this. So app.active environment should be stage. Then let me comment this. This should be prod. Okay, so the way I am doing for this particular Kafka, same way you can achieve for the DB as well. Okay, but I just want to give you the quick demo about this conditional on property. Okay, and this is the alternative of profile. Not only conditional on property, at the rate conditional on, there are different filter we just observe. I mean different annotation we observe, right? All you can use alternative to the profile annotation. Okay, I mean it depends on your use case, how you want to implement, whether you want to enable the things based on the properties, or you want to enable the things based on the class available on your class path, or based on the missing bean, based on the missing class, how you want to design it. Okay, that is how you can implement it. So let's do one thing, let's change it to the Kafka. I mean let's add the meaningful messages. Now let me restart it. So it started. Now if I'll filter this particular statement, because we enable the prod, right? I should see this Kafka prod being initialized. Let me filter it. Can you see here? We got the result. Kafka prod being initialized. If I'll just change it here, def or stage, based on that corresponding bean will be loaded here. Okay, so this is one of the way you can skip profile and you can switch to the environment using this @conditional on annotation. Fine. Now let's move to the next question, that is, what is the difference between @profile and @conditional? Okay, just to understand what things you can achieve using @profile and what all things you can achieve using @conditional. So if you'll go to the code again, the key difference you will find, see here, spring.profile.active equal to the value. It means profile is specifically designed for activating components based on the active profile in the application. So if you go to this config based on the active profile and the value what you have defined, it will load that corresponding profile. Okay, but in conditional, which is a more general purpose annotation that allow us to define condition for bean creation or configuration based on various criteria, not limited to profiles. It means using conditional we can define multiple criteria like conditional on bean, conditional on missing bean, conditional on class, conditional on property. There are couple of criteria. Okay, just explore that, you will understand more about this conditional on annotation. Now let's move to the next one, that is what is AOP. So if you are attending interview as a experienced candidate, then definitely you will get a question from AOP. So first of all, AOP stands for aspect oriented program, and AOP provide a way to separate cross-cutting concerns or secondary logic from the main business logic of our application. When I say secondary logic, it could be transaction related code, it could be logging, validation, auditing, or notification related stuff. So those things are secondary to my application. Without them also my code can run. Why should I mix up those cross-cutting concern and my business concern, right? So how I can segregate that? Using AOP. Let me walk you through one example. Let's say I have this product service, right? Let me go to the product service. Now in the product service, let's say in the save product method, I want to implement the cross-cutting concerns, which is nothing transaction. Then I want to implement logging. Then I want to implement, let's say, validation. So these are the secondary logic or cross-cutting concern which I want to implement in my save product method. Then also I want to implement same kind of secondary logic in my this get product by type method, and also I want to implement on this fetch location method. I mean everywhere I want to implement this secondary logic. Okay, so if I'll write the same piece of code which is secondary logic in my each and every method, it looks we are duplicating the code, isn't it? These are the secondary logic. Without these also my business code will work. So rather duplicating code here, segregate this secondary logic from my business logic, and that is where we can achieve using Spring AOP. So what you can do using AOP, each and every secondary logic I can define as a aspect where I can write this transaction related stuff. I can define a logging aspect and I can define this logging related stuff. I can define a separate aspect and I can tell to the Spring, hey, for this get product type, implement these three aspects. For save product method, implement these three aspects or implement these two aspects. Okay, that is how we can define it. So how you can define that, I will explain in a moment. So now let me name it transaction aspect, logging aspect, validation aspect, auditing aspect, notification aspect. So aspect means nothing. This is one of the terminology in AOP. Aspect means the class who contains your secondary logic. Aspect is the class who contains this validation specific secondary logic. Okay, so that is the reason we named it as a aspect. Okay, so I will explain in a moment, but before that there could be a chance to get few more terminology specific question. Let me cover them. So the next question, what is point cut and join point in AOP? Again, this join point and point cut is two crucial terminology in AOP. So let me explain them. So if you observe here in the save product method, I want to implement these three aspects, right? I mean transaction aspect, logging, validation, auditing, and notification aspect. Now first let me explain what is join point. Okay, so join point is nothing. Join point means the target where you want to implement this particular aspect. Now I want to implement the aspect, let's say transaction and logging aspect in get product by type. Okay, so it means the join point is get product by type. That is my target where I want to implement this particular aspect. Okay, so this particular method is my join point where I want to implement this different type of aspect. Now the next one is, what is point cut? So point cut is nothing the expression to tell to the AOP that who is your join point. So for example, say product is my join point where I want to implement this logging and transaction aspect. How can I tell to the AOP? By just defining the point cut. Okay, so point cut is a simple expression. By defining the expression, let's say I want to implement com.java.techie dot service dot, what is the method name? Say product of any argument. Okay, so in by defining point code you can define this kind of expression saying that okay, just implement the aspect to this particular join point what I have defined using this particular expression. Okay, so these are the simple terminology. It will make you confused, but if you understand it correctly, then you can happily play with AOP. That's fine. Okay, now let's move to the next question, that is, what are different type of advices available in Spring AOP? So in Spring AOP, there are 5 type of advice: before advice, after returning advice, after throwing advice, and around advice. Okay. So when to use which exact advice I will cover in a moment. So let me go to the code. Just remember the advice name. Okay. Before advice, and after returning, after throwing, and around advice. So let me go to the code. So let me take example of this. Any method is fine. Okay, so if you want to implement some logic which you want to execute before this particular method, then you can go for before advice. Okay, so the first statement is clear. The before advice, if you want to perform any pre-processing logic, or if you want to execute something before your target method execute or before your join point execute, then you can go for the before advice. Then after advice. So if you want something to execute, some post processing logic to execute after this join point execute or after this get product by type method execute, then you can use after advice. Okay, so see, this name itself is self explanatory. Now let's move to the next one, after returning advice. So there is something called after advice and another one is the after returning advice, why there are two different advice given by Spring AOP to just perform after or post processing logic. Let me tell you that. Okay, so go to the code. So we understand, if you want to execute something after this method execution, then you can go for after advice. If you are using after advice, it does not care about the exception. When I say does not care about the exception, let's say you are executing something in this method and you got the exception, but still your post processing logic will be executed because you have just used the after advice. But if you want, if there is a exception, you don't want to execute your post processing logic, then you can go for after returning advice. Okay, it will consider, even though if there is a exception, your after advice will execute, but if there is a exception, this particular after returning advice will not execute. So no exception, I mean it will execute if there is no exception. Now the next one is after throwing advice. Okay, so what do you mean by after throwing advice? If any exception occurs, then you want to execute your advice, then you can just use the after throwing advice. When it will execute, if any exception occurs. Then the next one, that is around advice. So around advice is the key advice in AOP term, because using around advice you can design lot of custom aspect. Okay, so let me show you that. So what do you mean by around advice? If you want to execute something before this particular method execute and after this particular method execute, then you can go for around advice. So you can understand, if it is around advice, then it is combination of before and after returning advice. Okay, so if you want to perform some pre-processing and post-processing at a time, then you can go for around advice. So these are 5 different type of advice available in AOP. So let me show you demo of one simple advice. Okay, so let me go to the project, then let me open the advice. I've defined something called logging advice. Okay, I just want to log the statement. So let me comment this. So the simple way to define the aspect, just annotate @aspect. When I say aspect, it contains the logic to execute. I mean the secondary logic to execute. And can you see here? I have defined the point code where exactly my join point available. I want here, hey, can you please implement these are the aspect. I mean this is what the expression I am telling you. com.java.techie service.product service, all the method irrespective of any argument. I mean in the entire product service I want to implement my secondary logic, which is logging related stuff. And I have just see here to define, to tell to the AOP that I want to execute the before advice, you can annotate @before. For after, you can annotate @after, and after returning, after throwing. Okay, around I have not defined here. I will cover with one different use case. Now if you observe here, I want this to be execute before any method from this product service execution, and this piece of logic will be execute after any method from the product service is completed, and if there is any error I want to execute this method. See here I have defined product service, but if you want to define for any specific method, you can, let me zoom this for you. You can do that, say product. I mean it is up to you, but currently I want to implement for all the method present in this particular qualified path. Fine. Now what I'll do, let me run this and we'll see the result, whether it is getting implemented before and after all the method is executed in product service or not. Let me restart it quickly. So it started. Let me clear this and I'll go to the postman. I'll hit the post request of products. Okay, so let me send the request. Let me give the valid input. Okay, ID, let me define something, name Arjun, this is the string, and price let's say 1200. Okay, now let me send the request. Invalid product type. Okay, this should be education because we only implemented the custom validation, right? Send the request, the record is inserted, right? Now better let me clear the console. I will retry again. Let me change the ID, send the request. Now if you observe, can you see here, before advice, I mean before execute of this product service, this save product method, I'm just capturing, this is the request body, and after the method is getting execute, I'm getting after advice related log statement what I have added here. This is the response body. Can you see here? Now I have defined after advice. So let's say if I am getting any exception also, whether it is getting executed or not. Okay, let me clear this. So let me run this with the same product ID so that it should throw the exception and we can validate whether after advice is working even though there is an exception or not. Okay, let me send the request. We got the error. Product code already exists in the system. Now go to the console and can you see here, this is the before advice logic. Then since we are getting the exception, throws advice is executed, and we can see the after advice. Even though there is an exception, we can see the after advice. That is what we understand, right? But if you are using after returning advice and if there is a exception, you won't get this after advice logic to execute. So to validate that, what I can do, I'll change it to after returning advice and I will restart the app. Let me clear the console, go to the postman, send the request, it added. So you can find only before and after. So I supposed to change it to after returning this statement. Since we have defined the log after advice, it is printing after advice. Anyway, it's fine that we are demonstrating the after returning now. Now if there is a exception, we want to verify whether this after returning is executed or not. Let me clear this. Let me send the same request with the same ID. Now I got the error. Go to the console. Can you see here? We only receive before advice aspect executed, and since there is a exception, throws advice is executed. So after returning statement is not executed. Okay. So that is the reason Spring AOP given two different type of annotation. I mean advice, after advice and after returning to deal with the exception. Okay, that's pretty cool. So you understand all the type of advice except this around advice. So I will cover the around advice. Now let's move to the next question, that is one use case. Can I use AOP to evaluate performance of a method, or is this possible to design a logging framework to capture request and response body of a method? So here if you read this question carefully, can I use AOP to evaluate performance of a method? How can you evaluate performance of a method? I mean, you need to find out the current time before actual method is getting executed, and after method getting executed, what is the next current timestamp. Then the next and the previous one, if you will subtract, you will get the performance of that particular method, right? Similarly, can you design a logging framework to capture request and response? I mean, before executing the method, what is the input, and after executing the method, what is the result? That is what the request and response, right? Now if you observe carefully, we are trying to perform before and after kind of logic, right? Some post processing logic and some pre processing logic. That is what the exact use case to use around advice. So let me walk you through one example to demonstrate around advice. So we'll evaluate the performance and we'll also capture the request and response using around advice. Now let me go to the code. So if I'll go to the project and if I'll go to the advice, already I created two different advice called log execution tracker, who will give you the exact time taken by that method, and it will and another advice is log payload advice, who will give you the request and response. Okay, so I have created two different annotation. Let me show you that. Yeah, so if you observe here, track execution time, I mean this is the simple annotation I have defined, and the implementation of this annotation you will find in the advice class. I will walk you through that particular step. Then I have created another annotation called log payloads. Okay, these are the two annotation I have created. Now for this particular track execution time annotation, I have defined this particular aspect where I have used the around advice. Let me zoom this for you. If you observe here, in pointcut, I am telling to the Spring AOP, hey, use this particular annotation or find this particular annotation on which method it is applied, consider that as your join point. Okay, so if you observe here, there is something called the method argument is proceeding join point. If you are using around advice, you must need to use the proceeding join point as a argument. Okay, join point will not work because you want the before and after result. So see here, I have captured the start time. Then I am telling to proceeding join point to proceed with the actual target method execution. Then it will execute the method. Then this you will get after advice. Okay, and then I am getting the result by subtracting them. Can you see here? See, this is what the point cut, and this is what the method. Okay, and this is what the actual target method call. before that I want this, and after this particular method execute I want this. This is the combination of before and after. Similarly, if we'll go to the log payload, this is the annotation and this is the advice. Here also if you observe carefully, I am telling to the around advice, hey, this is my point code, find the join point where you will find this particular annotation, okay, and execute this before advice related stuff, capture the request, and once the method is getting executed, just capture the response. Fine. This is what the example of around advice, and this is what the real-time implementation, guys. I have implemented this particular track execution time approach in one of my project, so it's fine. Now what we'll do, we'll use this annotation and we'll test whether it is working or not. So I will use here, okay, let it be track execution time log payloads. Now I have only added in this particular method, who is my join point. So only for this particular method it will give you the result whatever the logic we have in these two advice. Okay, it won't work for get product by type because I have not defined that annotation. We'll verify that right away. Now let me restart it. So it started. Let me clear the console, go to the postman, let me trigger this save product method. We got the result. Now if we'll verify here, first it execute the before advice. Can you see here? This is what we have defined, right? To capture the, let me zoom this for you. To capture the request and response, we have this log payload advice. It capture the request body. Then it execute the before advice, then after advice, then we got the response body. Again that is from log payload advice. And the log execution tracker we got here the statement. It took 41 millisecond time to complete. Now let me clear this and we'll try for some other method, okay, where we have not defined these two annotation. So I'll go to the browser. I'll just go here. Let's say I'll define education. We got the result. We got the two object. Okay. Okay, I have did a mistake. This should be the product name. I have added some username. That's fine. This is just a demo. Okay. So now if I'll check here, I'm only getting before advice and after advice. Whatever the custom advice I have defined to log the payloads and to track execution time is not getting displayed because I have not defined the annotation and my advice is not able to get the point code. So if you observe here, we are just telling to the point code, right? Just find the annotation and implement it. That is what my join point, we are telling to the point code. Since it didn't found those two annotation, it is not implementing it. That's the simple. Correct? So that's all for this particular part 5 video, and I will come up with the many more questions in upcoming session. So do let me know in a comment section if you guys have any doubts. That's all about this particular video, guys. Thanks for watching this video. Meet you soon with a new concept.